All right. This is the chapter 7 lecture. Let's see if I can't get rid of this. Go ahead and take a screenshot because for our next lab, which will be the photosynthesis lab, we're going to do this as a quiz. Yay. All right, photosynthesis. I love this little picture of these plant cells freaking out because humans invent the microscope and can see them. Honestly, we would die without photosynthesis. About 70% of oxygen in the atmosphere comes from the ocean. These are some ocean organisms that convert sunlight into energy for us. And it's really interesting because people are always like, oh, save the trees, blah, blah, blah. Whereas the algae and the phytoplankton and stuff are just kind of left behind. So it's very important to take care of the ocean. I cannot play these videos for you because I can't figure out how to make the sound come through on the recording. So you'll just have to watch them yourself. This one is a really great introduction. And this is an even better introduction. I highly encourage you to watch this video because it ties together photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which, as you will recall, are a cycle. One cannot exist without the other. I want to clarify that I'm going to be using some of these where did my head go? Some of these abbreviations, thank you. Abbreviations throughout the lecture. O2 means oxygen gas. H plus means hydrogen. E minus is electron because an electron has a negative charge. That's why we put the minus. And an organism is just anything that is living or was once living. All energy ultimately comes from the sun. Organisms can be classified into two groups based on how they obtain energy. They are either autotrophs or heterotrophs. Autotrophs are things that can harvest energy directly from the sun, like plants, and heterotrophs harvest energy by eating autotrophs or eating things that have eaten autotrophs. We are heterotrophs. Here's our first clicker question. The answer is D. At this point, I would draw this on the board. I hope you recognize this from our lecture about cellular respiration and fermentation. We're going to focus on this part over here, photosynthesis. 2 steps, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. And notice that there is a relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration through oxygen. Photosynthesis creates oxygen and cellular respiration uses it up. Recall that plants actually do not need humans or animals to survive. They can do cellular respiration and photosynthesis. They are producing oxygen for themselves. They are producing glucose for themselves. And then they immediately use up whatever they have produced, what they need, and we get the leftovers. So it's very fortunate for us that photosynthesis happens more quickly than the plants can use it all. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any leftovers. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are opposites of one another. At this point, I would write the equations on the board, but I can't, so we're not going to do that. The purpose of cellular respiration is to make ATP, and the purpose of photosynthesis is to make glucose. Our next clicker question, what is the purpose of cellular respiration? The answer here is A. What is the purpose of photosynthesis? The answer here is B. Now, if you guessed C or D on either of these, it is true that photosynthesis makes oxygen, and it is true that cellular respiration makes carbon dioxide. But those are just side products. Those are not the entire purpose of photosynthesis. This guy in 1960 took this big, I forgot what it's called, but this enormous jar, and he put a quart of compost and a cup of water and a little sprout of this plant in there. And he reopened it again in 1972 to add some more water, but ever since then, it has been a completely self-sustaining system. The bacteria in the compost do cellular respiration, and the plants do photosynthesis, and the plants also do cellular respiration. And then water cycles throughout the system. The only thing needed is light as input. If you were to put a blanket over this and cut off the light supply, it would die. But with light entering the system, it is able to survive through photosynthesis. This is just a nice picture showing some portions of the leaf. We've got mesophyll cells, which are inside a leaf. The vein is where sugar and water enter and exit through the leaves. Over here, we've got our stoma. These are the cells that, or stoma, I guess, are the pores on the underside of the leaf, and the cells surrounding them are called guard cells. That's where carbon dioxide enters into the stomata. Stomata is plural, and oxygen exits through the stomata. Plants can also lose water through their stomata during really hot days. Water will evaporate out through the stomata. So plants can swell and close their guard cells to close the stoma, to close the pore, the hole, so that water doesn't escape. And that's how plants can survive in really hot climates. Here's a picture of some stomata under a microscope. And these are the parts of a leaf. We have the epidermal tissue, which is like the skin, the strong cells lining the outside of the leaf. We have the stomata, which, as we learned, is small pores through which water vapor, carbon dioxide, and oxygen enter and exit the leaf. And the guard cells surround the stomata. Plants can close their stomata to reduce water loss. We have mesophyll cells, which are basically the cells that make up the majority of the leaf. It's also called ground tissue. This is where the chloroplasts are found. And obviously, we all know photosynthesis happens in the chloroplasts. Go up into the into Canvas, into the animations module. Click on the Chapter 2 animations. And this is going to help you relate Chapter 2 and Chapter 7. Water can climb up the tiny pores of a tall tree to the very top through adhesion and cohesion. That's how plants are able to grow so tall. At this point, we would do the photosynthesis worksheet, which I will post in the Chapter 7 module. So go ahead and do that. Do I have that posted? Gosh, I better make a note to myself. Okay. This picture is of the stomata of a cactus. Notice how swollen and large the guard cells are, because cacti live in very hot environments, and so they've got to rely on keeping their stomata closed during the day, or else they will lose a lot of water vapor. Where does oxygen exit the leaf? The correct answer here is C. Where does carbon dioxide enter the leaf? Correct answer here is also C. All right, now we're going to talk about how the energy and light is harvested. Chloroplast structure. This is a very basic drawing of a chloroplast. The only thing you need to know about are the stroma, which is the fluid inside the chloroplast. Recall that in mitochondria, we had the matrix, which was the fluid inside the chloroplast. But here we have the stroma. The thylakoids are these individual little pancakes, and they stack up on top of each other, and each stack is called a granum. Within the thylakoids, they are filled with fluid as well, and that's called the lumen. About everything is filled with fluid in biology. And the chlorophyll is located in the thylakoid membrane. So there's the thylakoid membrane. Notice that a chloroplast has two membranes, just like the mitochondria. We've got this outer membrane here, and then we've got an inner membrane, and then we've got the thylakoids. This is a microscope picture, a cutaway of a chloroplast. We have our inner and outer membranes. We have our stacks of thylakoids, which remember are called granum. The thylakoids are each individual pancake. They have space inside them. We've got the stroma, which is the fluid that fills the chloroplast, and we've got the thylakoid membrane, which is where the chlorophyll is found. Light reactions involve special chemicals called photosynthetic pigments, which is basically a chemical that absorbs light energy and gives it to electrons. Each pigment can absorb and reflect different colors. A pigment is just a color. Not all pigments are photosynthetic pigments. For example, take a look at your shirt. Mine is red. I have a red pigment in that shirt, but it is not a photosynthetic pigment. It does not absorb light energy and give it to electrons. So different photosynthetic pigments will absorb and reflect different colors. This is carotene. It appears orange to the human eye. Xanthophyll appears yellow, And this is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll appears green. Here's our next clicker question. What does a photosynthetic pigment do? The correct answer here is D. Where are the photosynthetic pigments? Well, we've already discussed that they are in the thylakoid membrane, and they can be found clustered in photosystems. A photosystem is a cluster of proteins that contain photosynthetic pigments. We've got all these photosynthetic pigments here, each of these green spheres, and the ones on the side are called accessory pigments. They're pigments besides chlorophyll that also pick up light energy. And then we have chlorophyll right here in the very middle. That is the main pigment. So this phospholipid bilayer here represents the thylakoid membrane right there. Remember, the thylakoid is an individual pancake in this stack of pancakes. Most specifically, where are photosynthetic pigments located? Correct answer here is D, in photosystems. The sun emits light in the form of waves, and here we have a picture of how light energy travels from the sun to the earth. And notice that the light is in the form of waves, and the waves are different lengths. All waves are not the same. Some are shorter, some are longer, as you can see from the picture. A wavelength is the length of a wave from peak to peak. So notice that this ray down here contains wavelengths that are very short because the peaks are very close to one another. Whereas this one has wavelengths that are very long because the peaks are not as close to each other. And wavelengths are a form of energy. Basically, whenever I say wavelength, you think energy. Here's another interesting picture of some waves. Okay, stop that phone. These are the higher energy waves with a shorter wavelength, a shorter distance from point to point. And these are the lower energy wavelengths, a longer distance from point to point. Different wavelengths have different names. Here are the names. We've got gamma rays, X-rays, UV, infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. And then also visible light is what goes in here. They show up to the human eye as different colors, but some of them cannot be perceived by the human eye. Only the visible light spectrum can be perceived by the human eye. And all wavelengths possess different amounts of energy. Shorter wavelengths have higher energy. So you can see these wavelengths are corresponding with the colors. 380 nanometers, that's talking about the distance between two peaks, two consecutive peaks, is the shortest wavelength that the human eye can perceive. That's very high energy. On the other hand, we have a wavelength of 750 nanometers. That's a very long distance from peak to peak. That's very low energy. And it's red is the lowest energy that humans can perceive with our eyes. Here's our next clicker question. The correct answer here is B. Whenever you hear wavelengths, I want you to think energy. Wavelengths are the same thing as energy in this context. All right, let's talk about some examples. Gamma rays have the shortest wavelength. They have very short wavelength, and they have the most energy. Whereas radio waves are on the opposite side here, and they have the longest wavelength and the least energy. Here's our next clicker question. The correct answer here is B. Visible light is in the middle of the light wave spectrum. This is what human eyes can see. Red has the longest wavelength, 700 to 750 nanometers, and it has the least energy of all the visible wavelengths. Violet, on the other hand, has the shortest wavelength and the highest energy of all the visible light frequencies. Here is another clicker question. The correct answer is true. This is a great little cartoon I found about wavelengths. This kid comes into the convenience store and says, "Do you sell ultraviolet bulb?" And he says, "Excuse me? What about regular violet bulb?" "No." "Blue bulb?" "No." "Green bulb?" "No." "Yellow bulb?" "No." "Orange bulb?" "No." "Rats, okay, I'll take a red bulb." And then he says, "I was hoping for something a little higher energy." And his friend says, "At least it is an infrared bulb." Photosynthetic pigments absorb different wavelengths. Every pigment absorbs different wavelengths. So each pigment absorbs different amounts of energy. The more wavelengths a plant can absorb, the more energy it can absorb. So it is a really good idea for a plant to have as many pigments as possible. It will have the main pigments, which generally is chlorophyll A and B, and then it will have accessory pigments, such as xanthophylls or carotene, and those will absorb extra wavelengths that are outside the frequencies that the main pigments can gather. So here again, we have our photosystem. Notice we've got the thylakoid membrane, and the green spheres are various photosynthetic pigments. Here are some examples of photosynthetic pigments. You don't need to know them, but I want you to look at them and notice that they're all different. Each of them will absorb and reflect different wavelengths because of these differences. Chlorophyll A is the main pigment, and then the rest of these are accessory pigments. Carotene, xanthophyll, and I don't know how to say that, but phycoerythrin probably. What is an accessory pigment? The correct answer here is A. What about this one? Why is it good for a plant to have as many photosynthetic pigments as possible, such as accessory pigments? The correct answer is B. Let's talk a little bit about absorption spectrums. An absorption spectrum is a graph showing which wavelengths a pigment absorbs. So over here, we've got an absorption spectrum. It shows for chlorophyll B and for chlorophyll A. And I've got a little color scale down here to show which colors correspond with which wavelengths. A peak on an absorption spectrum shows that a pigment absorbs that wavelength. So we've got wavelength on the x-axis and absorbance on the y-axis. If absorbance increases, that means that pigment absorbs that nanometer, that wavelength. Let's talk about chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A is the main photosynthetic pigment. So what does it absorb? Well, over here, it absorbs 400 to 450 nanometers, and it absorbs between 650 and 700 nanometers on the other side of the spectrum. So we've got 400 and 700. Let's keep track of that on the right side. Chlorophyll B is an accessory pigment. Chlorophyll B absorbs between 425 and 500 nanometers and between 625 and 650 nanometers. So let's put those on our little wavelength. The question becomes, what wavelengths are not absorbed? And you can see that between about 500 and 600 is not absorbed. So we've got some blue-green, some green, and a little bit of yellow right there. That is what the human eye will take in because the plant is absorbing all of those other wavelengths. It's absorbing this and this and this and this and this. So we can't see that. What we do see is the wavelengths that the plant rejects, the plant reflects. Here is another example of a absorption spectrum. We've got chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B and the carotenoids, which is another accessory pigment. So keep in mind, different pigments will absorb different wavelengths. Chlorophyll A and B are the main pigments, and a leaf appears green because it absorbs all colors but green. Green is reflected. At this point, I would do a demonstration with M&Ms where I would ask for a volunteer to come and sort out some M&Ms, and the volunteer would act as photosynthetic pigments. And so we would go through all the colors of M&Ms, and I would tell you which wavelengths you need to absorb based on this graph. And then we take a look at which M&Ms are left. And those are the wavelengths that the human eye can see because the plant has absorbed everything else. We can't see that. That's what the plant is using for energy. And whatever the plant is not using for energy is what is reflected back into our eyes. Accessory pigments absorb extra wavelengths of light and extra energy. These can be the carotenoids, the xanthophylls, and some others. This is what allows plants to turn pretty colors in the fall. So here, during warm weather, all you can see is the chlorophyll because that's the main pigment. But when the weather becomes cooler, the chlorophyll begins to break down, and that reveals the other photosynthetic pigments, which are always there. You just can't always see them because the green, the chlorophyll, is so overpowering. Here's some other examples of accessory pigments. You do not have to memorize them, but there's so many different accessory pigments. All right, next clicker question. How could a plant benefit from having many accessory pigments? The correct answer here is D. What about this? If a plant has a pigment that absorbs red, yellow, green, blue, and purple, what color will it be? All right, let's think about this. So if it absorbs red, then we're absorbing this. If it absorbs yellow, we're absorbing this. If it absorbs green, we're absorbing this. Blue, we're absorbing this. And purple, we're absorbing this. So what is left? This, orange. Orange is what's left for the human eye to see. So the correct answer here is the letter C, orange. All right, let's talk about the process of photosynthesis. Go into your textbook animation module and watch the animation photosynthesis. I want to emphasize that just like cellular respiration, photosynthesis is only rearranging atoms. No atoms are created, no atoms are destroyed. They are simply rearranged. So we've got over here our water molecules. We've got oxygen and 2 hydrogens on each one of those. We've got our carbon dioxide molecules. We've got 2 oxygens and 1 carbon for each of those. Photosynthesis pulls apart these molecules and rearranges the atoms and then attaches them together in different ways so that in the end we get glucose and oxygen. Photosynthesis has 2 steps. Obviously, it occurs in the chloroplast. So go ahead and take your handout that I had you print and label the chloroplast. There we go. Label the chloroplast. And label the stroma, which is the fluid inside the chloroplast. There's 2 steps of photosynthesis. One is the light reactions. And I want you to label this light reactions in thylakoid membrane. Each of those little pancakes represents a thylakoid. And notice that the thylakoids are absorbing sunlight energy. The second step is the Calvin cycle. So on this circle, I want you to write Calvin cycle in stroma. You can complete this table as we go along. I made it typable for you. It is also going to be part of your study guide for the next test. First, let's talk about the light reactions. The light reactions are a series of proteins embedded in the thylakoid membrane. They involve photosystems. These proteins carry out a series of reactions collectively known as the light reactions because they involve light. They're also called the light-dependent reactions. And the purpose is to capture energy from light and transfer it to electrons. Go ahead and watch this animation. It's a really good one. So come over here and look at this. We've got our photosystem here. And recall that each of these little green spheres is a photosynthetic pigment. The pigments are absorbing the light energy and then passing the energy from one to another. And they eventually end up here in the main pigment, which is chlorophyll. So let's go back over here. The light reactions, we're going to zoom in on the thylakoid membrane. So this here represents 1 thylakoid. And these are the proteins of the light reactions. And then we've also got our ATP synthase right here. There's our thylakoid membrane. Notice here we've got 2 photosystems. We've got this photosystem and this photosystem. Light reactions are in the thylakoid membrane. So what do the light reactions use? Well, obviously they use light. So go ahead and write light on your diagram. They use water. Fill in that little blue bubble as H2O. They use NADP plus and ADP and P. Remember, NADP is an example of an electron carrier. Electron carriers pick up electrons and take them to other places. Electrons are very energetic. They're very dangerous if they're left on their own, and they will just fly all over the place and bump into things and tear stuff apart. So we've got to enclose them in this molecule, this carrier molecule, NADP, so that we can get them to their destination. We're also using ADP and a phosphate, and those will be fused together into ATP. And oxygen comes out of the light reactions. What else? What comes out of the light reactions? ATP and NADPH. Notice in NADPH, we've got our 2 electrons here. Trying to draw a circle. There we go. NADPH is full of electrons. Electron taxis are what carry electrons from place to place. Here we've got our electron taxi that's empty, and then this one is full. Where are we going? The electron transport chain, duh. You might recognize this from our previous lecture on cellular respiration. Let's talk about the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the second step of photosynthesis, and it's basically just a series of proteins in the stroma, which remember is the fluid inside the chloroplast. They're called the light-independent reactions because they do not require sunlight. The purpose is to use the energy stored in the electrons from the light reactions to make glucose. So we've got our high-energy electrons here that come to the Calvin cycle from the light reactions, and those provide the energy to make glucose. So when you eat glucose, you're eating energy that came from electrons. Carbon dioxide is taken apart and the carbon atoms are used to create glucose. This process is called carbon fixation. That's a very important word, carbon fixation. Here's the next clicker question. Which part of photosynthesis actually produces glucose? The correct answer here is D, the Calvin cycle. So come back to your diagram. And let's talk about the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle uses carbon dioxide, so go ahead and fill that bubble in with CO2. It produces glucose, fill in that little hexagon as glucose, and it's using this ATP and this NADPH produce NADP and ADP with a free phosphate. This is about the Calvin cycle. I'm not going to make you memorize the details, but I do want you to watch this. Describing light reactions in detail. So previously, we went into a lot of detail about the Krebs cycle in cellular respiration. But this time, we're going to focus on the light reactions in photosynthesis. The purpose of the light reactions is to capture light energy and transfer it to electrons. Please watch this animation before continuing. It will help you understand the following diagram. But let me explain to you here what's going on. So we've got our thylakoid membrane. We've got photosystem 2, which actually comes before photosystem 1. They are named in the order of their discovery, not in the order that they come in the light reactions. So at photosystem 2, we've got light. It comes and is absorbed by the accessory pigments, bounced around, bounce, and then it hits some electrons. The electrons get excited. They jump up. Before they can leave the photosystem, they are caught and by these proteins and passed down through the proteins. These proteins are collectively called the electron transport chain. Then the electrons reach photosystem 1. They have no energy at this point because the electron transport chain took it all. And so fortunately, we're at another photosystem where we can harvest some more light energy, bounce between the accessory pigments, give the light energy to the electrons. The electrons are now excited with the energy. They jump up, but before they can jump out, they are caught by an electron acceptor, and they're used to make NADPH. And then we also have our ATP synthase over here, which is a separate process. First step, let's go into detail. So that was an overview. Let's go into detail. First, photosystem 2, which is this, gets electrons from water by splitting water. It takes water, the light comes, splits the water, and the electrons are taken out from water. This leaves us with oxygen and hydrogen. This is where the oxygen that you breathe comes from. So that's photosystem 2. Clicker question, at the very start of the light reactions, where do the electrons come from? Well, they come from A, water. Step 2, the electrons are energized by light. So we've got these electrons here. The chlorophyll and the accessory pigments, which remember are these green circles here, absorb light energy and pass it to chlorophyll. The accessory pigments are absorbing extra light energy. They're absorbing different wavelengths and pass it to chlorophyll, the main pigment. Remember, all these pigments are clustered together in photosystems, and there's chlorophyll, our main pigment. Where is chlorophyll located? The answer to this is A, photosystems. The source of energy for the electrons is, drumroll please, C, light. The relationship between chlorophyll and accessory pigments, what is the relationship? Correct answer here is B. All right, moving on. We're right here at the electron transport chain. This is just a series of 3 proteins, and the electrons are passed down the chain, and then they go into the second photosystem, get more light energy, and eventually they are placed into a molecule of NADPH. So remember, NADPH is our electron carrier. The electrons have made the journey from water through the photosystem, down the electron transport chain, through another photosystem, and finally to NADPH. And that's going to go to the Calvin cycle. Meanwhile, what's happening to all the energy that these electrons had? So remember, electrons get energy here at photosystem 2. They jump up, and then they're captured by the electron transport chain. And by the time they get to photosystem 1, they have no energy left. What's all that energy being used for? Well, it's being used to pump hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane so that we've got this concentration of hydrogen ions that's building up here. And where are those hydrogens going to go? Well, remember, all particles want to go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And we've got this high concentration of hydrogens here. There's no hydrogens. That's supposed to be a question mark. Above, on the other side of the membrane. So the hydrogens naturally want to go down their concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And the way they do that is by going through the ATP synthase. This is very similar to what happens in cellular respiration. The hydrogens go through the ATP synthase. The difference here is that in cellular respiration, that makes a huge amount of ATP, whereas here we're only making a couple. And the point of that is to get ATP to power the next stage of photosynthesis. So here we go, the hydrogen ions are going down their concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And they do that by traveling through the ATP synthase protein. We call that chemiosmosis, osmosis of chemicals. The chemicals, that is the hydrogens, are passing across the membrane through the ATP synthase. This causes ATP to be created, and then that ATP goes together with the NADPH that we created to the Calvin cycle. That's used to power the Calvin cycle. And remember that as the hydrogens go through the ATP synthase, that is causing it to turn like water through a water wheel. ATP and synthase combines ADP and phosphate to form ATP. Here's our next clicker question. Where does the ATP generated during the light reactions go? The correct answer here is A, to power the Calvin cycle. Please watch this animation about ATP synthase. And here's our next clicker question. What is chemiosmosis? Correct answer here is A. What causes the ATP synthase to turn? Correct answer is C, chemiosmosis. And finally, how does a concentration gradient help the ATP synthase to turn? The correct answer here is D. If you want to, you can do this interactive demonstration of the light reactions. It will walk you through each of the steps. Then go ahead and watch this. It'll bring all the information together, light reactions and plant cell structure. Now do the photosynthesis review worksheet. If you would like to email that to me, you are certainly welcome to, and I will check it for you. If we were in the classroom, I would show you an episode of Our Universe called Chasing Starlight, but we're not going to do that because obviously we're not in the classroom, and I'm sure not everybody has Netflix. It's narrated by Morgan Freeman, and this is true facts about Morgan Freeman. So you can watch the true facts if you want. It's freaking hilarious. It's hilarious. And you can go ahead and complete this if you like. This is just a concept map. I've listed some terms over here. And if you want me to check that, you can go ahead and email me the answers. Yes, I am aware that the letter G is not here. That was kind of a mistake. All right. I want to keep my ink annotations. No, I do not. That's it, everyone. Well, how do I okay, stop sharing. And there you go.